Hello, everybody. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for a couple more people to join in, and then we'll get started. Hello, everybody. It's 4:02, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Umair, and I will be your host for this seminar. Welcome to GSG, a new installment of the GSG seminars. Today, we will be discussing journal research. We have other previous seminars also, which is the GSG Professional Development Committee under the GSG has hosted before. So feel free to log into our website and take a look at some of our old events and seminars if you were interested in them. Also, we always appreciate your feedback. Please let us know how we can improve so that we can bring you more informative seminars like this today. These are a couple of our upcoming seminars happening all through the semester. We have public speaking up next on February 18th. We have visa issues and OPT issues for international students coming up on the 24th of February. And we have a seminar on maximizing your conference experience on April 7th. So please feel free to join us on these days so you can attend our seminars. I just want to let you guys know if there's at any point you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and add them in the chat box, and there'll be plenty of time at the end of the meeting to get through those questions. And then also, if our panelists are willing to answer your questions during the meeting, you could probably ask them too. I just want to welcome our participants and panelists. Thank you everybody for being here, especially Dr. Cherie, who is the professor in the Cognitive and Learning Sciences and Mathematical Sciences Department, and our other panelist, Dr. Arnis, who is the associate professor from the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. Thank you both for being here. I look forward to this. These are just a couple of the discussion topics for today. So I'm just going to hand it over to Dr. Cherie. Would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you. So welcome everyone to this session. Just to give you a little sense of how we envision this working, we have about 5 kind of major topics that we're going to talk about. We will each share our perspectives on that topic, and then we're hoping to have a few minutes for questions at the end of each topic, and then there'll also be about 10 minutes for questions at the end. So we're sort of thinking about this as 6-10 minute blocks. So I will pause after each section for you to ask questions, or feel free to add them to the chat. So I want to start out talking about choosing a journal. Choosing the right journal is really, really important in the publishing process, because if you don't submit to the right journal, it's likely that you'll get what's called a desk reject. A desk reject means that the editor will read your paper, and before they even send it out for reviewers, they'll just send it back to you because it's not what they publish in their journal. So you want to figure out whether your paper that you're writing is actually a good fit for the journal. So how do you figure that out? Every journal has what's called aims and scopes. You can find it on the journal website. So you can read about the description of what the journal publishes. And you want to find one, like I said, that fits what you want to publish. Another thing that I often do if I'm not familiar with the journal is I read a few articles from recent issues of the journal, and I try to figure out what's the journal publishing. Does it look like I'm in the ballpark for what this particular journal is looking for? Sometimes too, your own literature review will help you make sense of where to publish. So if you are citing a number of papers from the same journal, that might be a good indication that your paper is a really good fit for that journal. So, use your own reference list also as a guide for selecting a journal that works for you. A couple of other things: the impact factor of a journal. All journals are rated. There's more competitive journals and less competitive journals. My general strategy is to get in the highest tier journal that I can. So oftentimes, and not every paper that I write is in the top tier journal. I know that, but if I have a paper that I think can go in a top tier journal, I submit it there first. And then I, if I happen to get rejected, then I maybe go down a tier and try to submit to a different journal. You can never submit to 2 journals at once. Every paper should only be under review in 1 journal at a time. So you don't want to double dip and be using your work, in a couple of different ways. But the impact factor is really important, and you can look up journals in your area and see which ones have high impact factors. And the last thing that I might say, and then I'll turn it over to Arnie so that she can share some of her thinking, is I often try to think about the long-term plan for my publishing, because sometimes there's a choice, like my paper could go in journal A or it could go in journal B. But if I know that my next paper is going to be a really good fit for journal B, if I sort of have a plan of what's coming up, I might not submit the first paper there. I try to diversify the journals that I publish in because it reaches different audiences. And also, in general, editors don't like to keep accepting from the same authors consecutively or close together. So having a plan to be able to submit to different journals also, I think, makes a lot of sense. Okay, Arnie, I'm going to turn it over to you to add to that.
Okay. I hope you guys can hear me. Good afternoon, everybody. We will try to have this discussion as informal as possible, as you probably have noticed from the way that we have structured this seminar today. So definitely, I agree with the points main points that Cherry mentioned, as far as important um, characteristics of a journal to keep in mind when you think about submitting a work. Definitely, a literature review it's extremely critical. When you are doing your literature review, you of course you have to pay attention on the citations of that journal that you are reading as part of your literature review. You have to pay attention to the specific area that it's covered in that particular type of journal, as Cherry mentioned. As far as the impact factor, it's also when you think about the impact factor, another thing to keep in mind that is implicit related to that is the acceptance rate. So the acceptance rate varies quite a bit from one journal to another. And you have to keep that in mind because if you wanted that work to be published as soon as possible, if you need to graduate and you need to wait too much in order to have a publication, of course, the highest is the tier of a journal that you can publish, the better. But sometimes you have to do a little bit of a balanced game here. You have to balance at that time what's more important for you. It's really to have a high tier, um, high impact factor, or have a journal that publish in a journal or submit to a journal that the acceptance rate is a little bit higher. So that will be on your favor. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when you are doing this balance of what journal to accept. And of course, it's very, very important to read the website of the journal and pay close attention to what are the areas that that journal published. As Sherry said, nowadays, everything being electronic is quite quick that if the editor see your journal as not a good fit, they're going to immediately reject. They will not even move forward, send to the reviewer. So that means that you're wasting time. So during this entire process, time is very critical. And talk about time. So each journal has a timeline of between the time of your submission to the time of publication. So there are journals, there are fast publication journals that within a few weeks, the journal is published. The article is published. There are other journals, on the other hand, that may take 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. So that is another criteria or criterion, if you will, that you should also take into consideration. Take a look on the time frame that usually it takes between submission and publication. It's again very critical, and I it's something that I always use as part of my criterion to balance all those variables. And cost for my area, which is electrical engineering, electrical and computer engineering. Cost is very important because some of the journals that we publish can charge quite a bit for publication. So, and we are talking about $2,000 or more. So there are journals that are free publication. There are other journals that are not. And that depends on a variety of factors. If a journal is open to the public, if it's just online, if it's online and printed, if it's going to be available only for subscribers. So there are several reasons that determine the cost. So that is yet another parameter or another criterion that you need to take into consideration when you balance everything. Quality factor, acceptance rate, time between submission, publication, and then cost. To me, those are the main ones that I take a look, besides, of course, trying to choose a appropriate um, journal for my particular article, depending on the research area. So
So the one thing I might add to what Arnice just said, in terms of cost, make sure that you are not publishing in a predatory journal. There are several journals, if you get an article like saying, if you pay this, we can get your article published very quickly, that is quite likely a predatory journal, and they do not help to build your professional reputation. So be very, very careful. Same with conferences. If things are not peer reviewed and they're promising you quick turnaround if you pay them, that's a bad sign. And definitely I would stay away from those sorts of things.
yeah, I agree. That's an excellent point, especially now with the everything being online, or um, a large amount of the publication material being online. There are many bogus, if you will, online journals that we have to be careful with, definitely.
Yeah. We're going to pause here before we move on to the next subject. Does anyone have any questions specifically related to choosing a journal? If not, then I'll move on. But if you have questions that come up, that you think about as we move on, go ahead and add them to the chat, and there'll certainly be time to ask them at the end as well. Okay, the next topic we want to focus on is developing a writing plan. And there's different sorts of plans you need to develop. There's the plan for that specific paper, like what is this paper going to look like? What are the sections? What does my outline for the paper look like? And that's an important part of your plan, knowing that that plan should be flexible, because sometimes you start writing and it's not quite working right, and you need to rethink the plan. The other plan that I think is really important, though, is developing a long-term writing plan. There's always, looking at the short term is great in terms of, I'm going to get this paper written right now, but you also need to think about a long-term strategy for writing. And I think that's really important. My personal strategy is always to have one paper under review, one that I'm working on, and one that's sort of in the planning stages. I'm either collecting or analyzing data, or I'm conceptualizing the paper. So I always try to have papers in all three stages, which means I always have a continuous flow of publications. I'm not going to say a lot more about that, but it's something to think about for long term. When you're developing your writing plan, think about how you work best. You'll hear a lot of advice from people that say, oh, you should write 15 minutes every day. And that's great if you can do that. But I'm going to tell you that has never worked for me. I am not a 15-minute a day writer, and I've tried it and I've failed at it. My issue is when I start writing, I usually 15 minutes takes me to get started and get into the writing. So I don't get very much done if I set 15 minutes aside. So my writing plan usually involves blocking out a significant time each week. I usually try to do a half day on Friday or something, and just use that time to write so that I can do intense writing. So I don't write every day, but I certainly try to write every week, and I try to do it in more intense blocks rather than short time blocks. And you can do whatever works for you. One thing that you want to think about is, if you're working with co-authors, you do need a plan for how that's going to work. You might, for example, divide up sections of the paper, and your co-author might be working on the lit review while you're trying to write up, the data analysis or something. So think about how the work's going to be divided, and what kind of deadlines you're going to have. I personally have found I've written with groups of up to 8 people, and it's challenging. You need to have clear communication, and you need to have a plan. And the other thing that I would say you need to have is a clear understanding of who's going to be the first author, and how people are acknowledged on the paper. I find that having that conversation before we start writing is much easier than after, because after we've written, everyone feels like they've done a lot of work. But that's not always true. Everyone doesn't do equal amounts of work. So in my group, we decide who's going to be the lead author, and the understanding is then that person is also going to manage the project and do not the bulk of the writing, but some other aspects of the work, some of the managerial things. Last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Aranice is, I would also plan time for feedback. Getting a draft of a paper done and immediately submitting it, I do think it's a good idea. I usually try to find a friend that can read the paper before I submit it and give me friendly feedback, because then the glaring issues, to you it all sounds clear, but to others it might not be. So some of those major issues get caught in that feedback loop, and that pre-review, so that I don't get rejected by the journal necessarily. My friend is able to tell me some of these things that I should be focusing on. And I still do that now, and I've been publishing for 20 years. So it's not, it's not like asking for help is a bad thing. It's a good thing. And you should do the same for your friends then. Make sure that you are working with your colleagues to give them the same kind of feedback. Aranice, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, I definitely agree with Sherry that 15 minutes of block of time does not work out for me either. I have to have a good solid amount of time so that I put myself in a state of mind that I completely concentrate and focus on that. And 15 minutes is definitely not enough. So a block of time of a few hours, I think is the most appropriate way to do it. So for me, one thing that I like to do when work on a paper is that I like to it's just the way that works our mindset. I write what I call a backbone of a paper. I like to put the sections, at least the title of the sections first, and then I go from there of on that day, what's the section that I'm more prepared to work on. Um, Initially, I start, of course, with the introduction, and start adding literature review, comparing what I have in mind to with other authors have done in that particular area, and move on to work on the say the results and then the conclusion. But bottom line is that I like to focus on specific sections of the paper. I don't like to go back and forth in the same block of time. So if I have a block of time to work on the introduction, I do my best and work on the introduction. If I have another block of time to work on the results, I work on the results. And then of course, there will be several block of times that you have to read the entire paper and make sure that it's consistent. It has to tell a story. A paper or a thesis or a dissertation, it needs to have a flow from one section to the other one. You cannot just abruptly interrupt one and don't demonstrate any correlation between one section and the other. I find that it is very important to try to maintain a good flow. And a good flow, sometimes since you are doing that for such a long time, you may not notice as much as maybe the flow is not good. That's when comes the to have a feedback of a colleague, somebody that maybe somebody that has no expertise in that area. A paper or article, it has to be written in such a way that even if a person has no expertise in that area, that person should at least follow what's going on to a certain degree. So I think that's quite important. Now, one thing that Sherry mentioned was the ability to coordinate and work well with co-authors. It is very critical to have a good plan, because depending on the number of co-authors that is working on a single paper, it can get quite chaotic. So nowadays, of course, with internet and everything, it makes life easier. There are software that you can use to do that, to have multiple people writing at the same time. Of course, you can use Google Drive, for instance. I use Overleaf. So with Overleaf, you keep track of everything, of what the time the different authors have worked on different sections, so forth. It's very good to have a plan on who gonna be spending more time working what sections, and so you definitely have to have a plan on that. And another thing that's important, and I think is important, as Chair said, to decide from the beginning, is with regards to the author order. So because different groups of even different disciplines, they may do this differently. So for instance, in my discipline, the way that we establish author order is first author is usually the person who worked the most. It's not necessarily the person who wrote the paper, but the person that gave more contribution. And most of the time it coincides. First author is the one who produced most of the results. Not necessarily the first author is the person who gave the idea for that paper. The idea for that paper may have been given by, say, a PhD advisor, but the PhD advisor is usually the last name in a paper. So we do this seniority as well, that we, in our field, in addition to the author who contribute the most, is usually the first one. We try to maintain seniority as well, and usually the most senior in a group is going to be towards the last name. So the junior will be first names, and because most of the time the junior researchers are the ones who are doing most of the work. that's common. So that is something that it really needs to be discussed ahead of time, because it can generate a lot of issue if it's not agreed upon from the beginning. And talk about feedback, the importance of feedback. You need to leave plenty of time for that. I have spent, I, I have been, as Cher said, I have been over 20 years, writing papers. And each of my papers, I think, has like 10 drafts or more, because that is how it is. You always gonna find something that needs to be improved, and of course comes to a point that you say enough is enough. But don't have the illusion that the first draft that you're gonna write is gonna be the final draft, because that's not the case. That's really not the truth. You really need um, to have somebody give feedback, and you need to um, look at that. Okay, so I'm sorry I end up spend a little bit more time than I should. We probably should stop and having give a break for possible questions.
You guys are all quiet. You're allowed to ask questions.
Yeah, this is supposed to be informal, so that you feel welcome to ask questions. But if you want to wait for the end, that's fine too. I don't see any question in the chat.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So, is there any difference between the second author and the third author? Like, is there a contribution a little bit like different?
It's always tricky. I mean, the first author usually has a clear role, and but as far as second, third, fourth, sometimes it just, you just have to put people in some order. We usually, in my writing group, when we have large projects, usually have a first and second author determined. The first author is the major role, and the second one's, like in the supporting role, and then the rest of the authors. It doesn't matter. The people in the middle of the list, it gets a little bit murky. But for some like promotion and tenure reviews, for example, it does matter if you're at the top of the list. Some people care about that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other question?
Oh, there's someone just said this matters a lot from field to field. It sure does. And even discipline to discipline. Many fields simply list in alphabetical order. Yes, some do.
Yes.
And some have the primary author first and some have the primary author last. You need to learn what's happening in your field.
Yes, that's absolutely truth. All right, so should we move on to the next topic, preparing a manuscript? All right, so I will start with a few notes, and then Chair will follow up right after. So preparing a manuscript, some of the things to keep in mind is what is the specific format requirements for that journal. So that is number one. Different journals have different format requirements. What is the style of citations? What's the length? Because most of the journals they specify, at least in my field, the number of pages that you can have. So that's critical. The quality of images is of big importance as well. So you have to, again, that's when it comes to you doing your own homework and going take a look on the web page of that journal that usually has a tab that says um, information to authors, something on those regards. And you have to go there and read very, very carefully, because if your article does not meet journal format requirements, they can immediately reject without telling you, okay, you need to fix this and that. They just reject, and you have to figure out what you're going to do next. So it's not something to take lightly. Font size of image, the way that you should label figures, tables, everything has to be taken in great detail. So you have to pay attention if the journal is single column, double column, double space. If you're supposed to submit a Word file, sometimes journal require you to submit a LaTeX file to use BibTeX. So there are a variety of format requirements that you need to pay close attention. Now, the good news is that many journals, they have a template. So you can just use the template, and that saves a lot of time because the template has already built-in for lots of information, such as what is the font size to use in the sections, in the title, and so forth. So, and then the citation. So different journals have different citation styles. For the type of journals that I use published, we follow a specific citation style that's called IEEE citation style. IEEE is the main professional organization in my field and has a specific style that we follow. Other disciplines, they have different citation style that are used, and you have to follow whatever is the determination or whatever is the requirement as far as citation from that journal. Um, and so those are the main elements that I am remembering right now as far as preparing a manuscript. And of course, get very familiar with the system that that particular journal is using. So some journals would use a system that you have to go there, you have to have a login, and you mainly copy paste. There are others that you have to upload your file. So those kind of things you have to pay close attention. Cherry?
Yeah, I don't have a lot more to add, but I'll just say a couple of things. When you're reading those instructions that Aranice referred to, just be really careful because there's some subtleties that could put you over the word limit. For example, like some journals count the reference list, some don't. Some count like text and tables as part of the word count, and some don't. So you have to not only know what kind of length or word count you're allowed to have, but what's included in that count. And there's other subtleties too. I know in my field, some journals want the figures and tables right in the text, and some of them want them pulled out as separate files. So you really have to be careful. And a lot of that seems like just sort of small details that are nitpicky, and maybe you don't want to pay attention to those, but you have to, because if you're not following the journal guidelines, that you're giving the journal a reason to reject you, and you don't want to get rejected on a formality instead of on the quality of the work. So I'm going to leave it at that, just because we're a little bit behind in time, and then we'll have some room for questions. So are there any questions immediately about kind of the logistics of preparing the manuscript? Okay, if not, then I'm going to move on and talk about actually submitting the manuscript. So you get done writing and you have a good manuscript and you're really excited you're done, but you still have the submission process. And submitting a manuscript can often take more time than you think it's going to take. It's not something that you're going to just do in 5 minutes between classes, for example. It's much more involved with that. Everything now is submitted in online systems, or I guess the majority of things at least are submitted in online systems. And there's a lot of detail to attend to while you're doing that. So you do need to plan a real focused block of time to get it right. Some of the things that you need to think about when you're submitting a manuscript: most journals are going to ask for some kind of a cover letter. So it's a short letter to the editor of the journal where you basically, I just say I'm submitting this manuscript, and I don't usually write a lot, but you do want to write a pretty formal letter to the editor. Just saying that you're submitting the manuscript and you look forward to their feedback and so forth. But you should do it formally, dear Dr. So-and-so, and sign your name, Dr. So-and-so, and or if you're not a doctor yet, whatever appropriate title you have. So formality is good there. You also, many journals, because manuscripts are submitted blindly for peer review, you also often need a cover page, and the journal will give you specific information about what needs to be on that cover page. That's usually, in my field, that's usually where the authors are listed, like all the author names. It's usually if there's like funding that needs to be acknowledged, that's often on the cover page, so that it's separate from the manuscript. So your reviewers won't see the cover page because that would give identifying information and they know who you are. Because most review processes are blind, that means that you need to have a blinded version of your manuscript. And this is often not as large an issue early in your career, but it can become a larger issue throughout your career, because my work, for example, tends to build on my prior work. So oftentimes some of my prior work is cited as part of the in the manuscript as references, for example. So all of those references need to be taken out. I'll take out my name and my colleague's name and replace it with author, in the parenthetical or however you cite your references. So you need to go through and be very careful that you do that. You also, any other identifying information also needs to be removed. In my work, for example, we developed a framework that's pretty widely used in the field. And so we often use it in our own work as well, but people know it's ours. So we have to write about it in a way that makes it appear not to be ours so that people don't know that this is our own work. Before you blind your manuscript, I strongly recommend that you save an unblinded copy because you don't want to go back and recreate it later. So I always save an unblinded copy and then I create a blinded copy that I can submit. A couple other things. Oftentimes you need to have an abstract and keywords. So, ideally you'll want to write those ahead of time or think about them ahead of time. Sometimes the keywords are words that you have to pick when in the submission system. So sometimes you don't know what they are before you get there and you have to spend some time thinking about that. You do need to have contact information for all of your authors. So that's something that you want to gather ahead of time. And acknowledgements, especially if you have funding. Many funders, like the National Science Foundation, for example, require that you acknowledge their funding as part of your submission. So you want to make sure that you properly acknowledge them either in the manuscript or however the journal asks you to do that. So, I usually find that it takes a couple hours when I'm submitting. I just want to have time that I can do it right. And then they also will send you a proof and you can take a look at that. And actually look at the proof because sometimes things get messed up when you're submitting in the system and you want to go back and fix formatting issues and so forth and make sure that your work is presented as you would like it to. And I'm going to stop and turn it over to Arnis.
All right, so I will not spend too much time here. I'm gonna just add a few elements that were not discussed by Cherries. I would agree with Cherry as far as be very careful if the journal or even conference requires that your version is a blinded version, meaning no author's name, no institution name, remove any identifier whatsoever. So it's very important to remember if that is a requirement, because again, is another reason for rejection if you don't follow the guidelines. Um, as far as submission process in the past, um, you as if you were the corresponding author, most of the time the corresponding author you have to list that in when you are submitting is the first author, but not necessarily. It doesn't need to be. But what I have noticed recently is that before, some journals would just send an email just saying this journal or this conference paper was submitted and you are listed as co-author. Well, recently, actually last week, I had a journal that I was a co-author, and that journal required me to go through a system, create a login, a password, and acknowledge that I was really the co-author of that paper, that I was in agreement And also to require me to put a digital identifier that's called ORCID. Let me write down here. I don't know if I don't know if you are familiar with the digital identifier, but if the journal requests that and you don't have, you have to go to the orcid.org and create one identifier for you. So each author it's supposed to have a unique identifier. This is new, but just for you to know that if you are requested to add that ID, you have to go to the website and create that ID for you. So this was quite new that I had to do recently, and it takes time. Again, so that's what Sherry said, it takes time. And another thing that when you submit the manuscript, they're gonna ask as well, besides the contact information of the co-authors, it's gonna be again, what's the order of the co-authors. So just keep that in mind. All right, I'm gonna stop here in case you have questions on this particular topic before we move on. All right, let me look at the chat. Okay, so we probably should move on to the last point that we would like to discuss would be revising a paper. Revising a paper, of course, it's quite critical. It's sometimes you may need to do just minor revisions. Sometimes the reviewers will require major revisions. So, but the bottom line is that you have to incorporate feedback from the reviewers. You have to communicate with the editor in this process. You have to formally respond to the reviewers, and you have to follow deadlines, because many journals will give you, you have X number of weeks or X number of days to incorporate the comments of the reviewers. In the comments of the reviews, it can go from you need to rewrite this paragraph because it's difficult to understand, all the way to ask you to generate new results. So it can have a wide range depending on the case, and you have to take the reviews feedback very seriously, because the reviewers are for most part people with a experience in that area, and people that have the best interest in improve the quality of your manuscript. And of course, sometimes the way that they um, do this feedback, it may hurt your feelings a little bit, because it has hurt mine. Oh, please, why you said that? I spent so much time. But bottom line is that you have to read, and of course, chances are you're gonna get upset the first time that you read, and then you put the reviews there at least for 24 hours, you breathe, and then you come back and you look again, and then you're gonna say, oh yeah, this review was right. If I do that, it's gonna look better. Oh yeah, yeah, I didn't pay attention to this. So yes, I get, sometimes I get frustrated, but I completely acknowledge the importance of feedback from reviewers. I take this very seriously. So once you incorporate the suggestions of the reviewers, whether minor or major, you have to write a formal letter. Usually, I write a very formal letter to the editors and to the reviewers. And in that letter, you put the comments or questions, and you put the answers to that question or to that comment. And you have to indicate where in the paper you made changes. And if you agree, of course, with the comments of the review, but you have to do all that in a very formal way, using very formal language and technical language as well. Again, I'm used to say technical language because I write papers in the area of electrical engineering. So you have to, so that is the main steps on the revision process. And keep in mind that sometimes you may have 2, 3 follow-ups on that review. You review and then send back your paper with the comments, and the editor of that journal may request additional reviewers to review your paper, and then they come back to you. So you may have like 2, 3 rounds of reviews. So don't get frustrated, because this is normal. And that's how we do. And each time you have to do your best to be very polite with the reviewers, to be pay close attention to what they are saying, and trying to adjust your paper the best way possible, so that it will be following the requirements, and answer to the best of your abilities the question, comments, and suggestions of the reviewers. I think it's pretty much it. Cherry?
Sure, thanks. I think one thing, and Aranice kind of said this too, a good review process should make your manuscript better. So instead of thinking about the review process as something negative and people attacking you, for example, think about it as a process to make your work even better. I always find if the review process goes well, my final paper is much better than the initial draft that I submitted. So I think you need to kind of go into it with a positive mindset. Ideally, a good editor is going to, oftentimes in my field, there's 3 or 4 reviewers for the paper. And, sometimes, of course, the reviews are conflicting. One reviewer thinks I should do something, and another reviewer thinks I should do something that seems very different. Ideally, in those situations, the editor will summarize the reviews and make it clear what are the major areas that you need to address. You should still look at everything all of the reviewers said, but in the best case scenario, the reviewer is going to, or the editor, sorry, is going to do some of that work for you. Unfortunately, that does not always happen. And that's where the revision process becomes very difficult. So when you're responding to the review, one thing that I think that, it's important to realize, you don't have to incorporate everything that the reviewers say. You should address most of it, probably, the majority of it, but sometimes there's a comment that just doesn't make sense. There's either like 2 reviewers have told you conflicting things, or the last paper I just revised, one of the reviewers said that there was a piece missing and it was clearly in the paper. So in those cases, in my response, I just said, the piece that you said is missing is located on page 24, blah, blah, so I didn't address it, but I didn't change the paper because of it, but I still addressed it in the sense that I told the editor why I was not addressing it. So you can tell the editor you're not addressing comments, but you should have a good reason if you decide to do that. The way I do a response to reviewers, and you can, there's different ways to do it. Arani says she writes a letter. I usually prepare a table, like a 2-column table that has the reviewer comments in one column, and then my response to that in another column. So it's sort of, a line by line. Here's what you said, here's what I say. And, like Arani said, I tell them, on page 10, this piece was edited in this way, to address the comment. So I try to just kind of do it piecemeal like that. It also makes it easier for me when I'm working on it to see which cells I've addressed and which ones I have not. I think that, let me see. Oh, the other thing I wanted just to talk about, we're talking about revising, and, revising takes place when you either get a major or minor review. So that's when the paper, the journal's interested in your paper, but it still needs some work. You're also going to get rejections. And I guess I just want to address rejections very quickly, because, just because your paper is rejected from one journal does not mean you need to throw it away. In my career, I have never thrown a paper away. Every paper that I've written has gotten published somewhere. It might not have been in my first choice of journals, and it might not have been in a top tier journal, but it's been published. So I think, after you get over the rejection and feeling sorry for yourself, you need to pick up the paper and try again. And, even if I'm going to submit to another journal, I still look at the reviews and I still revise based on the reviews, because a lot of times those reviews are still going to make my paper better so that it has a better chance of getting accepted in the next journal that I submit it to. So, I think it really, you need to develop some thick skin if you're going to be a researcher, because, sometimes you need to just, feel sorry for yourself for a day and then pick yourself up and go at it again. And you can be successful if you're doing some quality work. You can get most of your work published that you want to. Any questions, I guess specifically, first of all, to revising and resubmitting, but then we have about 10 minutes left, and we intentionally wanted to leave time for discussion and questions if any of you have them. And you can either do them in the chat or you go ahead and turn on your microphone and ask them. Or any questions around publishing that, even things we haven't touched on maybe. How many revisions are typical? I would say in my case, at least 2. Well, it depends if the first one's major or minor. If the first one's minor, which means they're basically accepting your paper as it is, but there's a few small things you need to do, then sometimes 1 revision's enough. If the first one is major, then you probably, there's probably going to be a minor one that follows, would be my guess. That's been my experience anyway. And Arnis, I don't know if your experience is different.
Yes, no, I agree with that. If the first one is major, you may have to go 1 or even 2 more rounds. I have never been involved with a paper either as author, co-author, or as a reviewer, because I review a lot of papers. I have never seen more than 3. If it's not resolved by the 3rd, then comes the answer to the question that somebody just asked: have you ever been rejected after revision? Not me per se, but I have seen others in that situation. That I actually did review a paper 2 months ago that it was rejected because we tried to communicate with the authors, and we asked for certain areas of the paper to be changed, and the authors did not do it, or didn't do to the point that we thought was enough. So yes, it can happen.
I think the question is, what is something you know now about publishing that you wish you knew when you were early in your career? I think really it's just, it's a long process. It's something that you really need to commit to. It does get easier. I will say that.
Yes.
I think one thing that I know now, once you start getting in a flow, I think the earliest papers are the most challenging and the most difficult. And, I know early in my career, I was like, wow, I don't know if I want to do this forever. This is grueling. But, once I got in a good workflow and I have a good flow of papers, I think that has really made the process a lot better. I was trying to think about anything specific. Zarnis, do you have anything to say there?
Yes, what I have is that I wish in the beginning to have more of a sense that feedback most of the time are indeed to improve your paper. And
That's
even
true.
though you feel a little frustrated, with time you get less frustrated. So in the beginning, I felt very frustrated when I spent like a year working on a paper and then had some comments that I perceived as very negative. Nowadays, I don't see that way. I see, well, let me take a look and go from there. So feedback most of the time is indeed to improve the quality of your manuscript.
Mhm. I would agree.
So let me see the other one. If you get reject from journal, how do you choose the next to submit your paper? So if it's rejected, one thing, the first thing that I look at it is the reason why it was rejected. It may have been rejected because that I thought that would be a good fit and was not indeed a good, that manuscript was not indeed a good fit for that journal and was automatically rejected. That may happen. And sometimes it also depends a little bit of the author. So the next journal, it may be the same tier if I have made the change that I now feel the changes are enough, or it can be a lower tier if I am in the hurry that I want it to be published and I think that time is relevant for that particular piece of research. Because sometimes I may should say quite often, time is really important. The timing that you publish is important, because what you publish today, somebody else may publish tomorrow, and then your work becomes obsolete.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll just say, yeah. So sometimes I use the tier system, to choose another one. Like Arnie said, though, it really depends on why it was rejected. If I just feel like it wasn't a good fit and there's another journal at that tier that might be a better fit, that's okay. But sometimes you do need to go down to a larger tier, and as you write more, you'll get to know, like, we just submitted a paper and we thought it probably was not a tier 1 journal, but we thought we'd give it a try. And it got rejected, and we're like, okay, we're going to concede and go to the next year. So, it really depends on the reason for the rejection. Constitutes major and minor revisions. Major revisions are substantial rewrites of sections of the paper. It could be that they want you to do a more thorough lit review. It could be like Arnie said before about you need some more results. I do qualitative research, so a lot of times they want like richer examples or more data really to show what I'm seeing in the data. So major revisions are, you're going to be rewriting substantial chunks of your paper in a major revision. Minor's usually more than grammatical errors, though. I mean, minor is still like tweaking pieces, but it's usually fewer pieces. I don't know. Is that consistent with you, with what you found, Arnie?
yes, I agree with that. Usually minor is you need to rewrite, or you need to account for somebody else have done some work related to this area and you forgot to cite. So maybe you need to do a better job with your citations. So things like that are considered minor. Definitely major is, besides extensive amount of writing that may require, you may need to generate new set of data to convince the reviewers that you are in the right track, that the assumptions that you are making are consistent. Or sometimes, for instance, you didn't do a good job put together a specific type of graph. So that actually would be on minor, that you have to use the same data but redo your graph. So redo your plot, so something like that.
Mm.
How do you choose or chosen as reviewer for journals? Well, in my field, quite often you chose as reviewer because the editor knows your area of work, or sometimes because you have published a manuscript in that particular journal. But most of the time is try to do a match, the editor try to do a match with your area of expertise and that specific topic of that manuscript. So in my area, that's how it's done. How about you, Cherry?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One thing that I would really, really strongly encourage you to do as graduate students. In my field, grad students often are conference reviewers, and that's a really good place to start. To sign up in, actually, sometimes like when you submit a paper to a conference, they ask if you're willing to be a reviewer. I would encourage you to do that. Conference papers are a little bit lower stakes than journal reviews. So that would be a great place to get experience and kind of to get a feel for what it's like to review. I agree with what Arnie said, that a lot of times the editor chooses you for your expertise and what you've published. But there are also ways that you can go to journal websites and sign up to be a reviewer. For some journals, not all journals. But the caveat there is when you do that, they're gonna say, what's your reviewing experience? And if you say none, and it's a good journal, they're probably not gonna pick you. So that's why you wanna get some reviewing experience, like with conferences and other things, so that if you do volunteer to be a reviewer, that you have something to hang your hat on to say, I've already done this kind of work. But it's a good thing to do, though. If you can, if you have time and you have opportunities, certainly volunteer to do that. It's a great way to start getting into the profession. And reading other people's work will help you understand what you should and shouldn't do in your own work, because you'll get to see, well, that didn't work out very well for that person. So take advantage of those opportunities. Reminder to fill out the survey. That's from Emily. And then last thing is, a paper rejected for formatting or technical issues. Is it fair to correct the problem and resubmit? Usually you have to, well, oftentimes I don't usually submit to this. Well, you should, first of all, you shouldn't get rejected for formatting or technical issues, because you should be following the author guidelines. So that's very important. You don't want to be doing that. Usually you don't want to submit to the same journal unless the editor invites you to. Sometimes I've seen situations where the editor will say, this involves a substantial rewrite. I'm not accepting it now, but I invite you to resubmit it as a new submission. And you have to basically start over. So it's not like a revise and resubmit. It's start over and submit this as a new paper. And that's the case where it's more than a major revision. That's atypical, though. Usually you have to go to a different journal.
Yes, and one thing that I forgot to say is that every time you submit a journal, your journal, or I should say a manuscript, your manuscript is going to get a manuscript ID number. So anytime that you communicate with the editors or in the website, you have to make sure you list that number as a way for your paper to be appropriately tracked. And another thing is that you will never be in contact directly with the reviewers. It's always through a system or through the editor.
Yeah, you'll never know. In my field, you'll never even know who your reviewers are. Everything in my field is double blind, including conferences.
Yeah, in my
You don't know
field,
who they are, and they don't know who you are.
yeah, you don't know. Yes.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Those were great questions. Thanks for contributing, and thanks for coming today.
Yeah, thank you for your participation. And if in the future you have a question either for me or Cherry, send us an email. We'll be more than happy to try to help you. But make sure you also take advantage of your advisors, either master or PhD advisors. They definitely would be a great resource because they, of course, they have more experience publishing, and you should follow guidance from your advisor as well.
Well, thank you, everybody. I just want to thank Dr. Cherie and Dr. Ernest once again for coming today and giving us a very informative session. I also want to mention that they are contactable. So would you like to send out your email addresses on the chat, or we could probably just email them too if there's any other questions?
Sure, I can put mine in the chat if that would be helpful.
I just want to remind everybody also, we have other academic seminars coming up once again. So if you are available, feel free to join us on those days. There is a feedback survey. The link is on the chat. So if you could please fill it out at your convenience, we would really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.